Today we're going to replace this belt on that lawnmower. The reason behind this is if your Honda lawnmower features the Roto Stop or blade stop system, you have to remove the blades, the blade holder assembly, the driven disc, the clutch, the drive disc, the brake holder assembly, the brake return spring, and the brake rotor cable. Also, you'll find while doing this, the bolt that holds everything together sits on a bearing, so it continues to spin. I'll show you an easy way to get that off as well. And before we begin, like we always do, shut off the fuel and also disconnect the spark plug. Before we start working on the underside of the lawnmower, let's go ahead and remove a couple items first. We're going to remove the pull cord assembly first. So there's three 10mm bolts that are holding on the shroud on the bottom. There's going to be one on each side of the rear wheel. Remove the first one, like that. And the second one is on the opposite side. It's a little further back, so you might have to move this wheel out the way to get to it. And the last bolt is going to be located on the back underneath the bagging door. All right, now that we got all the 10mm out, there's three of them. We got one more bolt holding it on. It's a little bit different. It's going to be a number 6 Allen wrench, just like that. Now that we got all of our exterior bolts out, we can go ahead and flip her over and start working underneath the lawnmower. Now I'm working on my bench, my workbench. If you're working on the ground and you need to flip this thing over, always make sure that the air filter is pointing up. All right, first thing we want to do is get these blades out the way. It's a 14mm socket. Also, please note, when you're removing the lawnmower blade, do not lose these washers. They're very important. They also go in a certain direction, and we'll explain that when we reinstall the lawnmower blade. Now that we got the lawnmower blades off, we can get the last two bolts that are holding on the shroud. Here's a little pro tip for you. Remember those bolts we took off on the outside of the deck earlier? Go ahead and remove those mounting brackets so they don't fall off and you lose them. All right, now that we got all the bolts holding on the shroud, it's time for it to come off. At this step, we're ready to take apart the blade holder assembly and brake plate assembly. So there's two ways to get this off. The first way to get it off is with a cordless impact or a pneumatic impact, preferably with an anvil. That way you get a little bit more torque. Now, if you're restricted to hand tools, the first thing you're going to notice, when you go to put a wrench on this thing, she's just going to spin. That's because this bolt is sitting on a bearing. So like I said earlier, when your wrench moves, the bearing moves. So you're either going to need a second hand, or you're going to need to have someone hold the top of the flywheel while another person turns this wrench. Now your first option is to grab a 19mm socket, set it on the flywheel nut, and have someone hold it up here while another person turns it down there. Now, the only problem that you may run into is you might loosen this flywheel nut, and that's the last thing you want to do. Plus, if you're working by yourself, it could be a little bit difficult. What I prefer to do, if you're working by yourself, grab a bar, set it right in there, just like that. That way you have enough leverage to work by yourself, and that will keep the nut from moving, the flywheel nut from moving, because we don't want to loosen that. This gives you enough leverage where that you have enough to hold your left hand up here and the other one below. Now that you got the flywheel safely secure up top, you can go ahead and loosen the nut for the blade holder assembly down here. You're just going to turn in opposite directions. All right, now that we got that loose, we can go ahead and take everything apart. The blade holder assembly, the clutch, and the driven disc should all come out at one. Just like that. You got your driven disc, your clutch, and the blade holder assembly. Next, go ahead and remove the drive disc. And when you pull this off, there's going to be a key under here, or a keyway, or a ward-if key. Make sure you do not lose this guy. Go ahead and set that in a secure spot until we need to reinstall. The next step is to remove the brake assembly. First thing we want to disconnect is the brake spring or brake return spring. Honda recommends wrapping your pliers in some kind of duct tape. They don't want you to damage the spring. It's up to you, it's optional, but they say don't damage it. I'm probably going to listen to them. Now that we got the brake return spring removed, we could go ahead and remove the clutch cable or rotor stop cable. Set that to the side. And now that we got both those disconnected, the brake assembly should just slide right off. And last thing to remove is the pulley itself. And last thing to do is remove the belt from the transmission. Go ahead and lift the transmission up and remove this cable. That way she'll fall down freely and you can see the top of the transmission pulley. Once you got a clear view of the transmission pulley or the top of it, go ahead and hold the belt tight on there. That's going to keep the pulley from moving, and you can remove this 14mm nut on top. Go ahead and grab your new belt, lay it on top of the pulley, grab the top pulley, and make sure that these dots on here are opposite of each other before you mount it. Just like that, opposite sides. And next, go ahead and reinstall the nut. And before you go ahead and tighten it down, just double check and make sure that these dots are opposite of each other. Hold the belt snug, and give it a couple ugga-duggas. There you go. Go ahead and lift the transmission back up and make sure that the back spring is installed first. Just like that. So there should be tension on there. You can see the spring in the back is connected. Go ahead and lift it all the way up and reinstall the cable. All right, quick review. When installing the pulley, make sure that the dots line up, make sure the cable is attached, and make sure the spring in the back has tension on it and it's hooked up. Now we're going to reinstall the belt pulley and the brake assembly. Grab your pulley, wrap it around the belt, slide her up, just like that. When installing the belt, make sure that the belt is between these two metal guides. Next, grab your brake assembly, go ahead and slide that over the pulley, and you'll notice that it's only one way to put this on. There's a guide right here. Slide that all the way up, as far as she could go. Next, before we go ahead and install the return spring, we need to make sure that the cable is back in place. So go ahead and reinstall the cable. Now that we have the cable installed into the brake plate assembly, we can go ahead and grab our return spring and reinstall. After you install your return spring, double check and make sure that this cable is properly installed. A lot of times when you go to reinstall the return spring, you'll forget that this cable needs to be hooked up at the same time. This has to be installed before you install the return spring. So just make sure that the cable is in its proper place and she's secure. All right, so we got our return spring properly installed. We double checked, we made sure we have the cable installed here. Now it's time to install the driven disc, the clutch, the drive disc, and all that other good stuff. First step, you need to make sure that your ward-off key or your keyway is lined up properly with the pulley. That way we can reinstall our key. Go ahead and reinstall the key, just like that. The key goes in the lower slot. There's 2 slots on the crankshaft. There's an upper one and there's a lower one. It needs to go in the bottom slot. Next, install your drive disc. Just like that. She may not stay on there, so you might have to two-hand it. And next step, we need to install the driven disc, the clutch, and the blade holder assembly. It's easier just to install it as a whole. Just make sure before you install the blade holder assembly and the clutch and all that other stuff that the drive disc is properly in its place, that it's in the keyway. You could feel it. It'll put up some resistance. You want to make sure that that's in its proper place. Now, before you install the blade holder assembly, you got to make sure it's in the proper order. It should look like this: blade holder assembly, clutch with the letters facing up, and driven disc. Once you got the drive disc on and you have your blade holder assembly in the correct order, go ahead and slap that on without moving it, just like that, on top of the driven disc, and drive it home. Now, Honda recommends torquing this down to around 40 foot-pounds. Now that we have our brake assembly back together, our blade holder back together, we can go ahead and reinstall the shroud. All right, now that we got our shroud in, basically go ahead and reinstall in reverse order. When you're reinstalling the shroud, there's 2 bolts that are going to look a little bit different than everybody else. They're going to have a shoulder on them. Unlike the other 10 millimeters, these 2 bolts go on the inside here. Right side and the left side. All right, so make sure you got all the bolts installed before you set her back down. We've got 2 on the side here, and 2 of the special bolts, like I said earlier, with the shoulder on them. Those 2 bolts go right here. And last thing, go ahead and install the blades. Remember that these washers go on a certain way. It's kind of hard to tell here, but they're curved, and you want the curved side to the back of the bolt, so it looks like a U. The curved side is going to go to the back of the bolt. It should go up like that. Go ahead and tighten them down. Torque spec on that from Honda is 40 pounds. All right, go ahead and reinstall the pull rope assembly. And the last 2 bolts to install are going to be on the back. And you're done. Thanks for watching. Hope this helps.